Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Uh, this is Westchester's Greatest Generation with Bob Abbott. I'm Dan Glauber, the local history librarian for the Scarsdale Public Library. Just so you know, we are recording the program from a camera in the back, so part of the audience, your backs are being recorded. So if anyone, just a fair warning, if anyone doesn't want to be recorded. And if anyone has questions, I have a second mic that I can bring over to you for discussion because I think that we'll need the mic to pick it up for the recording. So before I introduce Bob, I just wanted to give a brief introduction about Scarsdale's World War II history. It's estimated that 2,100 men and women from Scarsdale served in the armed forces during the conflict, while an additional 42 served abroad in the American Red Cross and the American Field Service. Residents not able to serve in the military found other ways to help the war effort. American Legion Post 52 oversaw the services of 591 air wardens and 144 auxiliary police. Between 1942 and 1944, the Legion also manned an aircraft warning service tower in the Fort Hill area of Edgemont, constructed with help from the town club. An emergency medical service under the direction of Dr. Burton Latin participated in air raid drills and trained to serve as first responders in case of an attack. Villagers participated in salvage drives that collected materials for the war. Scarsdale boasted high rates of participation in several war bond drives that purchased a total of 125 Thunderbolt fighter aircraft for the United States Army Air Forces. By the end of the war, 82 Scarsdalians were dead or missing. A monument to those who served in World War II, dedicated in 1949, is located at Boniface Circle in downtown Scarsdale. The Scarsdale Historical Society recently digitized a film from 1946, which we have here at the library in our storage, produced by Scarsdale residents, chronicling how Scarsdalians united and rallied in support of the war effort in the 1940s. It was produced and screened as part of a fundraising campaign for Jewish refugee children. I encourage everyone to go to the Historical Society's website to view the film. And just a warning that other than the captions added by the Historical Society, the film is presented as originally created and may contain language which may cause offense. Now, Yonkers resident Bob Abbott was 3 years old in 1945 when VE Day arrived. He remembers his family celebrating, though at the time he couldn't really understand why. Over the next few years, he encountered many disabled veterans who made deep impressions on him. By the time he was 7, he decided there was nothing more heroic than serving your country. A Navy veteran and retired sales and marketing man, Bob has spent much of the last 25 years interviewing dozens of veterans from the area, collecting oral histories on over 200 hours of tape and hundreds of pages of transcripts. He's compiled 35 of these interviews into, is it still unpublished, an unpublished book? In their own words, the stories of World War II combat veterans from Pearl Harbor to D-Day and Tokyo Bay. Today, he continues to do what he can to preserve the memories of Westchester's greatest generation through speaking engagements and interviews. He's also working on ways to preserve his audio recordings before they deteriorate beyond salvage, which is something I hope that the library and the Scarsdale Historical Society can help with. And with no further ado, I'll introduce Bob Abbott.
Thank you. You just took half of my story away here. It's very true. I was 3 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor of our apartment in the South Bronx by the Yankee Stadium, playing with some Lincoln logs. My mother and father exploded in a kaleidoscope of emotions, hugging, kissing, laughing, crying, screaming, dancing. The war's over, the war's over, the war's over. I had no idea what the words meant, but I knew it was something really special. We lived in an apartment building with 48 tenants. 6 were returning World War II veterans. One man, a good friend of my father's, was wounded. He was in a hospital in Staten Island. My dad, a New York City fireman, we didn't have a car. And on a number of occasions, we would take the Whittle-on-Jerome train down to the South Ferry, Staten Island Ferry across in a local bus. And all I remember is a 4 or 5-year-old kid with these white-clad nurses pushing all these wounded sailors and soldiers and Marines up a big grassy knoll. And it made a profound effect on me. And as Dan said, when I was 7 years old, certainly by the age of 10, 1991, 1951, the Korean War started. And to me, there was nothing more noble than dying, fighting, killing communists, as crazy as that may sound today. I eventually went to the Naval Academy. I had gone to Manhattan College, Manhattan Prep, on the grounds of Manhattan College, and they had offered me a scholarship to the college, which I politely declined to go serve my country. And I was at Annapolis 3.5 years. I failed 2 engineering courses. I was commissioned a civilian, and I thought at that point my life was over. I went back to Manhattan College to see if I could transfer some credits. Not many, but some. And the dean of admissions looked at me very seriously and said, "Young man, we would not be the right school for you." I looked, I said, "Brother," I said, "why is that?" He said, "We offered you a scholarship out of high school. You turned us down. We don't think we should accept you now." And I was astounded. I said, "Brother, I didn't go to Fordham or St. John's, Iona. I went to go serve my country." He said, "I understand, but still, we don't think we'd be the right school for you." So I was working down around the Wall Street area, and every couple of days I'd pass this building, Fordham University, 302 Broadway School of Education. And I thought to myself, this would be a convenient place to go, but forget it. I didn't go to Fordham Prep. But one day on the dare, I went in. Jesuit got me a cup of coffee, said, "Young man, how can I help you?" And I told him what I just told you, and he smiled. He said, "We'd be honored to have you as a student." I said, "Father, I'm confused." I said, "I didn't go to Fordham Prep, but you'd be honored. I went to Manhattan Prep, and they don't want me." He says, "You've got to understand." He said, "We're a lot smarter at Fordham than you are at Manhattan." So that was 1963. I graduated from Fordham in 66. Years later, Manhattan College had a weekend MBA program. And I lived in South Yonkers. I could almost walk to it. So I signed up. And what I would do on weekends is I would go down to their gymnasium, the Dratty Gymnasium. But when I was in high school, there was no Dratty Gymnasium. That particular parcel of land was homecoming barracks for the returning World War II veterans going on the GI Bill to get their college degrees. And then years later, when there was no need for it, they tore it down and built the gymnasium. And hanging from the rafters are the names of all these members of the Manhattan College Sports Hall of Fame. And I recognize most of the names. One most prominent was Lindy Rimangino. He won the Olympic 1952 Helsinki 100-meter title. But there was one name that wasn't there. I thought, where's that guy? And I kind of filed it away. A few years later now, as a graduate in Manhattan with an MBA, I get an alumni newsletter that they're looking for volunteers for Manhattan College Sports Hall of Fame Committee. So I called the chairman up. I said, "Look, I'd be interested, but let me be upfront. I did not get my undergraduate here. You guys wouldn't take me. I got it for them, so I don't think I qualify." He said, "No, no." He says, "Any degree at all qualifies." I said, "Fine, count me in." And I went down to Manhattan College Library and got all 4 years of the school newspaper, the Quadrangle, that this man, Tyrone Pennell, was at Manhattan College. Ironically, we were both born October of 1941, same month, same day. I was a good athlete. He was phenomenal. In 1 year in Madison Square Garden, he set 2 national high school records. He was a hurdler. He was a broad jumper. He was a high jumper, and he was fast as hell. And I put together a detailed presentation, 12, 14 pages, 10 or 12 pages of every event he was in, the points he scored, the distance, the time, the whole bit. And I went to the first meeting of the Hall of Fame committee to present him. And one of the guys in the back of the room, a sort of room like this, I didn't know anybody. He says, "Where's this Abate guy? Who's this Abate guy?" And I kind of raised my hand. I said, "Bob Abbott back here." He says, "Why don't you do your homework?" I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You're proposing a guy for the Hall of Fame. He's already in." And I looked at the guy. I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "Who are you?" And he gave me his name, and I recognized his name from doing the research. I said, "You guys were teammates." "Yeah, yeah." "Well, if Tyrone Pennell was in the Hall of Fame, wouldn't you have gone to his induction ceremony?" "Absolutely." "Well, did you?" "I don't know. It was a long time ago." I don't know why, but I had printed out a listing of every name of the members of the Hall of Fame. And we're not whispering now. And I walk up to him. I said, Pennell starts with a P. He's not here. He says, "Oh, geez, I just assumed he was in." I said, "Well, he's not." He said, "Well, here's the thing. Manhattan College will never take 2 guys from the same team into the Hall of Fame the same year. So what you're going to do is you're going to vote for his roommate, who was also ironically his teammate." And the guy they were looking at was a good guy. He was in the Olympic tryouts in Mexico City in 1956. And then Bob Abbott, you withdraw your nomination for Tyrone Pennell, resubmit it next year. And I said, no way in hell. You should have been in here a long time ago. I'm not gonna make it any longer. He said, well, here's the thing. He says, no one in this room is gonna give you a second nomination, and you need three, so get used to that. So when it was my turn to talk to the group, I basically told them, I told you, I said, I'm told I'm not gonna get anybody a second nomination. I pointed to the three people, I called them out by name, and I said, if you and you don't second this nomination, hang your head in shame. They took the vote, and they put Tyrone Pennell with his roommate into the second and final round of voting. So when the meeting is over, this guy come over to me and he said, you're a real pain in the ass here. He said, we got to talk. I said, yeah, what is it? He said, no, not here, down at the bar. So we went down to a local bar, 242nd Street, Broadway. And he's in there with his friends and he comes over to me. He says, since you're being so obstinate, here's what I'm going to do. He says, I'm friendly with Tyrone Pennell's widow. I'm going to ask her to write a letter to the group requesting we do not vote on him this year. And I looked at him, and especially with a little young lady back here, going to clean up my language, but I said to him, if you do that, you will lower than a certain portion of a snake's anatomy. And I walked out. 6 weeks later was the final go round. And at this point, they say to people, if anybody has additional information to submit, they can. Most people, when they submitted somebody for the Hall of Fame, wrote the name on the back of a postcard or a piece of paper. I did a detailed presentation. They say anybody else has more to submit, now's the time to do it. And all kinds of updates are coming in. It was my turn. I said, well, I guess invitations is sincerest form of flattery, but I gave you everything I had the first time, except for one thing. And I took out of my pocket a news article written by the Brooklyn Tablet, the sports tablet. And the editor of the Brooklyn Tablet said of all the athletes he ever met, Tyrone Pennell was by far not the finest athlete. He was the finest young man. He was a volunteer. He was a mentor. He was a tutor. And when he heard he was killed in Vietnam, he felt he lost a member of the family. And I looked at the group and I said, unfortunately, Tyrone Pennell is not here tonight. Number one, to ask you for your vote. Number two, to thank you for your vote. What I do. They took the vote and put Tyrone Pennell with his roommate into the Manhattan College Sports Hall of Fame. First time ever in Manhattan College, two guys from the same team the same year. That was. Yes, yes. I say to me, a mic is like a hand grenade. I don't know what's going to go off. That was the week of Father's Day, 1997. It was nighttime. I went outside, looked up at the stars, and I said, Tyrone, buddy, this one is for you. My wife and I were invited to the induction ceremony November of that year. We're in the back of the Manhattan College Chapel. We don't know anybody. It's time for communion. And I see a young African-American girl get up wearing a Marine Corps fatigue jacket. I looked at my wife and I said, my God, I think that's got to be his daughter. Because what basically happened is Tyrone Pennell graduated June of 1964, commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. His baby daughter was born Memorial Day week, 1965. He was killed in Vietnam, Thanksgiving week, 1965. This girl goes to communion. She turns around. She comes down the aisle, tall, beautiful girl. Mass is over. Everybody files out. We're the last to go down the stairway. And as I'm going down the stairs, I hear a female voice yell out, Bob Abbott, who's Bob Abbott? And I kind of raise my hand. This young woman comes over. She gives me a bear hug. She says, you're my guardian angel. I say, what are you talking about? She said, I learned more about my father reading your proposal than I've known my whole life. Ever knew his favorite color, his favorite ice cream. My mother will never talk about him. She says, you're now a member of my family. You've got to sit with us at dinner tonight. I said, it'd be an honor. Halfway through dinner, she looks at me and she says, there's a book about Vietnam and my father's in the book. And I'm a military buff. And I looked and I said, oh my God. I said, what book is that? She said, Dear Americans, Letter Home from Vietnam. It was like she hit me with a brick. I said, my God, I've got that book. I didn't read it. I browsed it. And she smiles and she said, that explains it. I said, what do you mean? She said, my dad was talking to you. You didn't hear him, but you got the message. So I went home that night. The book has about 200 letters. And the author, Bernie Edelman, says probably the most poignant letter in the book is from a young second lieutenant, Tyrone Pennell, to his infant daughter. I'm going to paraphrase it. Dear Tracy, like most men, I always wanted a son. When I found out I had a son, I was somewhat disappointed until I saw you and held you and kissed you. And then I realized I was the luckiest man in the world. Boys become men, girls become daughters and stay daughters for the rest of their life. I'm going to be gone for a while. Make sure mommy teaches you how to say hello, daddy. I love you, daddy. I missed you, daddy. They never had that conversation. But that was 1997. And something in the back of my mind kind of clicked because, as I say, I'm a military buff and I save an awful lot of information. And in 1995, the Westchester Journal News had a special pull-out edition of World War II veterans. Dozens of men in the military uniforms when they were in service, older men now retired. And I thought, I got to thank these guys. And there were no cell phones, thank God, in those days. And with one exception, I called every man and thanked them on the phone. And also, with one exception, every single man said, there's nothing to thank me for. I just did my duty. The only people you want to thank, you can't because they're over there under the little white crosses. And I would say, sir, I understand what you're saying, but can I ask you a question? Yeah, what is it? Would you consider a man awarded the Medal of Honor to be a hero? Oh, yeah, absolutely. You're right. I said approximately 435 medals were awarded in World War II. If those men had not been born, or if those men had not served, we know it would have not been victorious. I don't like to use the word win because war is not a game. But without the non-Medal of Honor awardees, men like yourself, we wouldn't be having this conversation or the life we have. So in my humble opinion, you're a hero. And I want to thank you, not on the phone, but in person. No, there's no need to. You thank me already. Sir, I'm not looking to do you a favor. I'm asking you to do me a favor. Can I please come by and shake your hand? All right. And I'd go by each man's house, a little attaché case, ring the bell, knock on the door. Invariably, it'd be Bob Abbott. I don't know what your problem is. You need a hobby because I have nothing more to tell you. And then I'd say, sir, can I ask you one question? Yeah, what is it? What is your memory of December 7th? And in every single case, the man was transposed to where he was. I would go, come on in. After a few minutes, I'd say to the man, sir, what you're telling me is living history. Unfortunately, I don't have a great memory. I don't take shorthand. But in my bag here, I have a tape recorder. Can I record what you're telling me? Yeah, go right ahead. And invariably, an hour, 90 minutes later, I'd leave with the man's story. And I tell the man, look, I'm a two-finger typist. It's going to take a lot of time. I'm not going to edit one word, not one letter in one word. You want it's in there. And I'd go back a week, 2 weeks later and give it to the man. And that's what I've done over the years. But roughly, just about 200 men. And as you can appreciate, the stories are powerful and poignant. Give you one example. I interviewed a man in northern Westchester. He was a Marine Corps veteran from the South Pacific. Not a big guy. And in some of these cases, I will not give the last name out of respect for the family and their confidentiality. But Joe was not a big guy. But he said to me, he said, basically, most things I ate, I shot. I said, what do you mean? He says, I was a phenomenal shot. Deer, squirrel, venison. He said, usually it was one shot in the head. I'd cook it, I'd eat it, I'd food for a week. And he said, the day after December 7th, I enrolled in the Marine Corps the next day. And I was a little taken aback because I knew he had a young son. And I said, Mr. So-and-so, I said, I'm a little confused. I said, you had a young son. You'd have been exempt. You would not have done it. And he looked right through me. He says, are you suggesting I'm going to wait for those MFs to come over here? I'm going to kill them over there. And his was the most graphic interview I've had, which is understandable for a combat veteran from the South Pacific. And he would say to me that he never missed the enemy, usually one shot. He said, even if he was amongst a bunch of civilians, he says, I never hurt a civilian. I always got the guy. He said, but unfortunately, I'm a failure. I looked and I said, a failure? I said, what do you mean? He said, I only killed 37 of those guys. I said, well, that's a lot of people. He said, it wasn't enough. There were 48 stars in that flag. I wanted one for each state. I only got 37. So I consider myself a failure. He landed in the South Pacific. It was Iwo Jima. It was also at Okinawa, which was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. And at the Battle of Naha, the bloodiest battle on the island, he's coming down the road one day. And his whole interview, as I say, was rough and tough and rough and all of that. But now all of a sudden, his voice changes. He says, I'm coming down the road. I see this dead woman, this little kid holding on to her. He said, I went over. He said, I picked that little kid up. I carried him all the way back to the rear. I gave him so much sugar tablets. I think about that little kid all the time. I wonder if that little kid remembers me. Now, at that point, I belong to a veterans group in Montrose. And every couple of weeks or so, a new guy comes in and you introduce yourself. And new guy comes in and I tell him I interview World War II veterans. He says, oh God, he said, I knew a World War II Marine. He was one tough SOB. You'd have loved to have interviewed him. I said, what's his name? He gives me his name.
I said, I interviewed him. He said, you gotta be kidding me. You in there? I said, yeah. He said, oh my God. He says, I'm best friends with his son. I said, well, here, let me do this. Because at this point, the man had died. Tell the son I've got a transcript and I'd be more than happy to give him a copy. Oh, no, no. He said, not father, the son, they hate each other. He said, one of the happiest days for the son was the day he buried the old man. And I thought, oh God. So I waited about a month or two. And I went to the guy a second time. I said, look, I don't want to be a pain in the neck here. I said, but you think your friend might change his mind? He says, I doubt it. Here's his phone number. You call him. So I called the son up and I said to him, I said, I probably shouldn't be making this phone call, but I got your name from so-and-so. I interviewed your father. I got a transcript. Would you like a copy? You got a copy of the transcript? I said, yeah. Oh, do me a favor, print the effing thing. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he hung the phone up. So I waited a couple of months, calling back a second time. I said, I know what this is really dumb. I'm stupid. Call me just, dumb. Want to ask you one last time. Send me the damn thing. And he gives me his mailing address. And I sent it to him. I wait a couple of weeks, call him back. His whole demeanor on the phone changes. He says, oh my God. He said, I read this transcript. He said, I told my father hated me. That's why I hated him. But when I read what he said in there about the kid, and he picked the kid up and he carried him all day, and he shared some food with him, and he thinks about him all the time. And that's not even his kid. I'm his kid. He said, maybe he didn't hate me because he really got screwed up in that war. Maybe he loved me, but he couldn't show it. He says, oh my God. He said, I wish I had this thing years ago. So you never know how people react to those kinds of things. And it's just, you know, I interviewed a young man. He was also kind of a hunter. He was from rural Alabama or Georgia, I forget which state now. And he also basically was proud of the fact that most things he ate, he shot. He was in a rural area and he shot all kinds of animals and ate them and so forth. His mother was a nurse. His family had a problem. They got divorced. They moved to New York. December 7th, he's at the Polo Grounds watching the New York Giants play some, I think, Brooklyn football team. And the announcement comes over the loudspeaker, Pearl Harbor's been attacked. And he decides that night, once the game is over, go to 42nd Street, be the first guy in line to enlist the next day in the Marine Corps because he wants to kill as many of the enemy in the South Pacific as possible. He goes in first thing in the morning. Sergeant looks at him. You're looking kid. He said, how old are you, kid? He said, I'm 16. Get the hell out of here. You're a kid. Go across the street. Maybe the Army will take you. So he goes across the street to the Army. They ask him his background. He mentions his mother's a nurse. They make him a medic. So he goes from being a guy that wanted to kill as many Japanese in the South Pacific to saving as many American lives in the Battle of the Bulge as possible. Comes home. His mother, understandably, is furious. Has no idea where he's been. He's been going all night. And all he wants to do is go to bed. And she says, no way, you're not going to bed. She says, you kept me up all night. There were no cell phones in those days. You go to school. So he's going to Fordham Prep. And he's in the back of the classroom. He's a junior. And he's kind of nodding off. The teacher comes over, slaps him on the back. Wake up, Baker. What's going on here? Oh, yeah. What are you doing? I was thinking about those poor guys at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, get out of here. Come back when you're ready to learn. And of course, he never went back. And he did say many, many lies in the Battle of the Bulge. And when I'm interviewing him up in Mayapack, he's in bad condition. He's laying on a couch and he's very uncomfortable. And he said to me, he said, the biggest mistake in his life was never going back to Fordham Prep. He said, I should have gone back. He said, but how can I go back? Go back to a bunch of young kids, teenagers, here I am, a battle-hardened veteran. You couldn't do it. He said, but I wish I had. So I went down to Fordham Prep and I spoke to the principal. I told the principal, the guy's name is Dick Baker, the Dick Baker story. He said, oh, he said, we'd be honored to have him come down here anytime. We'll give him a high school diploma. I said, unfortunately, you can't come down. I said, but I'll be more than happy to drive you up. So I drove him a few weeks later up to Dick Baker's house and his family was there. And he, 60 years later, he gets his Fordham Prep diploma. And he said it was one of the happiest days of his life. So that's, one man's story. Another man is Frank Carafa. Frank Carafa is from New Rochelle. Frank Carafa was the oldest of Shoemaker's 6 children. And it was in the midst of the Depression, it's late in 1930s. And he realizes, it's just, you can't get a job these days. And he sees an ad in the paper that the Army is looking for volunteers. So he decides, I'm going to volunteer. And he ends up in the Army. He's in the South Pacific. He's behind Japanese lines. He's seriously wounded, and he's recuperating in a Colorado hospital. And one day, as he's walking down the hall as best he can, he sees a notice on the board. They're looking for volunteers for a new type of warfare, mountain warfare. They're looking to teach guys how to ski with a machine gun and a rifle going 35 miles an hour down the slope. And he thinks to himself, holy mackerel, I don't even know how to ice skate. These guys are going to teach me how to ski. Man, count me in. And he signs up for what later becomes the 10th Mountain Division. He's over in Italy in early 1945. And this young, newly commissioned lieutenant is trying to take over the squad and lead. But at this point, Carafa is a seasoned veteran. He's been in now for about 3 years. And most lieutenants, if they're smart, will ask the sergeant, what do you think we should do? And he tells the lieutenant what the lieutenant should do is he says to the lieutenant, you wait here, I'll go out and get the machine gun nest. And no, I gotta do it. So the lieutenant goes out about 50 yards. He's shot. He's on the ground. He's screaming in agony. So Frank Carafa goes out to him, grabs him by the arm, twists him over. The guy screams in agony, pulls him back to the line. And for the next 40 years, Frank Carafa would say that one of his proudest moments was he saved a young lieutenant, young Irish guy named Doyle, some guy named Doyle. And it wasn't until about 1995 or so that his wife gets a phone call from Senator D'Amato saying, is your husband Frank Carafa of the 10th Mountain Division? She says, yes. He says, I've been appointed by Senator Bob Dole to find out who actually saved his life. A lot of people have claimed to do that. And what we have found is it was your husband. And we're having a reunion of the 10th Mountain Division in Fort Drum later this summer. We definitely want your husband to be there. And we know he's very active. He was president of the VFW and all kinds of groups. But do not, under any circumstance, tell him we had this conversation. We want it to be a complete surprise. But make sure your husband goes to that meeting. And of course, Frank was going to go anyway. So he's sitting out in the front row with one of his buddies, and this guy gets up and he says to his friend, you know, that guy looks kind of familiar. I don't know where the hell I seen him before, but he looks kind of familiar. And it's Bob Dole, and he says, I want to thank everybody in this room for their service, but especially one man. Without him, I wouldn't be here today. And that's you, Frank Carafa. And Carafa, not just the guy next to him, and says, what the hell he's talking about? His name is Dole, not Doyle. I saved a Doyle. And that's when he found out for the first time that he did save Senator Bob Dole's life. And when he died, Senator Bob Dole came to New Rochelle and gave his eulogy. So that was his situation there. Another fellow from New Rochelle, John Guthrie. John Guthrie on December 7th was in the Waldorf Astoria. He was an African-American, and he was in the kitchen cleaning dishes. And when he heard about December 7th, he thought, I got to volunteer. And he volunteered. And as we all know, the U.S. Armed Forces were horribly segregated during much of the war, if not all of the war. And he landed on D-Day +4. And when he went ashore with his group, his platoon, every man in that platoon had a rifle except John Guthrie, because he was just considered to be like, you know, the dishwasher. They gave him a pistol. He had a pistol to fight the Germans. Later on during the invasion, as we're cleaning out bunkers in Germany, he's with a group, a squad of guys cleaning out a German bunker. Other 8 or 10 guys are in front of him in there. He's the last guy there. And out of nowhere, a German comes with a modified flamethrower, throws it into the bunker. All the guys in the bunker die, except for John Guthrie. He was, quote, lucky, unquote. He was only burned over 40% of his body. And he's recuperating in an Army hospital. And he wakes up one morning to hear a gruff voice calling out to him, God, kid, we need more guys like you. And he gets awarded his Purple Heart. That guy that was calling out to him was General George C. Patton. So that's John Guthrie's story. And also another man from New Rochelle is Bill Lynn, William Lynn. I'm sorry. No, old age is catching up on me here. This is very embarrassing. Bill Moy. Bill Moy, also African-American, not a big guy, short guy. And he said to me, he said, I was raised in a League of Nations. He said, we had all kinds of guys in our neighborhood. black, Hispanic, German, Irish, Italian, Jewish. He said, we all got along. He said, the only thing was we had some bullies. And he says, I wasn't a big guy, so I had to learn how to defend myself. And boy, he said, I was good at it. He said, nobody played with me. Nobody messed with me. And he decides to enlist in the army, also once again to help put food on the table. And he goes down with his best friend, a young Irish guy. And they get down to Governor's Island to get sworn in. And they get sworn in. It comes time for noon meal. And this big burly sergeant comes out. He says, okay, guys, it's time for lunch. Okay, he says, all you white guys eat first. And then he used the N word. He said, you ends, you wait till we're finished. And he said his first reaction was to jump the guy. He said he knew he couldn't beat him up, but he knew he could get him on the ground and he could hurt him badly. But he also had to promise his mother. His mother made him promise. She said, Billy boy, you bring home an honorable discharge. Do not besmirch the family name. And he made that promise to his mother. And he realizes he can't do that because he made the promise. He looks out the window, he sees the Statue of Liberty, and he thinks to himself, my God, what have I gotten into? For the first time in my life, I'm experiencing prejudice, racial prejudice, and it's at the hands of my government. He went on to serve in 4 battle campaigns, North Africa, Southern Italy, Southern France. And he was awarded, as I say, 4 combat stars. He came home and he said to me, he said, I left my anger over there. Unfortunately, when he came home, his mother had already died. But I would meet him every month or two, go to a local place for a cup of coffee, some breakfast. And invariably, if he was walking down the street, mothers would cross the street with their little kids to come over to say, good morning, Mr. Bill, how are you? He was the most beloved veteran I've interviewed. He was phenomenal. He just had a wonderful sense of himself. And he also had dropped out of high school. And I said to him one day, would you mind if maybe I could try to help get you your high school diploma? He said, oh, Bob, he said, I'd love it. He said, that'd be phenomenal. But at that time, I also became a very active out-of-town grandfather. So I wasn't around a whole lot. And several years later, I woke up one morning and all of a sudden it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Oh my God, Bill Moyer's diploma. I never followed through on it. And I called him, hoping to God he'd answer the phone, because at this point, he was like 98 years old. He answered the phone. I said, Mr. Moy, it's Bob Abbott. I said, I'm so sorry. I owe you a real apology. He said, you don't apologize to me for a damn thing. He said, but just out of curiosity, is this about my diploma? I said, yes, sir. Yes. He said, well, he said, remember one thing. He said, I'm not getting any younger. And I said, sir, I'm going to call you back. And I called up the superintendent of schools, a lady whose name was Sue Kelly, and I told her the Bill Moy story. And about 3 weeks later, they had a special ceremony for him in City Hall, and they presented him his high school diploma. The Journal News was there. They did a nice little story about him. He said, this is the most important piece of paper, except for my DD 214 I've ever had. I couldn't be happier. I waited about a week, and I called the high school back, and I spoke to the principal, Reggie Richardson. I said, Reggie, if Bill knew I was calling you now, he'd be very mad at me because he could not be happier. But wouldn't it be nice, because this is around March or so, if we could give him his diploma in June at graduation ceremony? And he kind of laughed. He said, Bob, he says, I love these, but the guy's 100 years old. I said, yeah, but he's 100 going on 80. And in June of 2015, Bill Moy led several hundred high school graduates onto the parade grounds at New Rochelle High School. There was standing ovation. He got before the group. He told them to respect your elders, your God, do the right thing. He says, you're looking at an old guy like me and you think, what do we got in common? Well, let me tell you, you're the class of 15. 2015. I'm also the class of 15, born in 1915. And for about an hour, I have it all on little tape. People lined up to shake his hand, introduce him to the son or daughter or grandchildren. So that was the Bill Moy story. And one fellow I interviewed was born and raised in Brooklyn. His mother died when he was young, and he had a very strict father. And he was never allowed to go more than 3 or 4 blocks from his apartment house. And he was an altar boy. And he said mass, served mass every week, every Sunday, and sometimes during the week. And he said to me, he said, the most embarrassing day of my life was the day I got inducted, because the induction center was about a mile from the house. my father wouldn't let me go alone. Can you imagine that? Here I am. I'm 18 years old, and my father almost wanted to hold my hand. He said it was the most embarrassing day of my life. He said, I went from being an altar boy carrying rosary beads and a crucifix to a combat veteran carrying a rifle and hand grenades. And he landed D-Day +6. He was very actively involved in the Battle of St. Lo. And he's going down this road one morning and he sees a seriously wounded officer calling out, Padre, Padre. And Bob goes over to him to comfort him as best he can. And the man wants to dictate a letter to his wife, apologizing to her for dying. And I don't know where he got it, but Bob apparently had a pad or something. And the man dictates the letter. And Bob never did find out where to send it. He still has or had the letter. And then the man yells out again, Padre, Padre, and Bob goes back to him and whatever he says to console him. He's telling me this story in his kitchen up in northern Westchester County. He's in the kitchen. He's got a big Formica table with a whole bunch of World War II remnants, bazooka shells, grenades, a few other articles. They're all safe at this point. And he tells me that story. And he says, for that reason, I've never been back to the Catholic Church. I kind of looked at him. I said, what do you mean? He said, that day, he said, I made that man think I was a priest. I wasn't. I sent his soul to hell. That's why I've never been back to the Catholic Church. And I guess without realizing, I must have smiled because all of a sudden he smashes the table. Half the stuff goes flying. What's so bleeping funny? And I said, no, there's nothing funny. I said, let me tell you a story. I said, I was at the Naval Academy. I was in my junior year. I wasn't on the football team, but we were playing the University of Pittsburgh out in Pittsburgh. And several of us had weekend liberty. So we went to the game. And the next morning, Sunday morning, I'm in the men's room. It's a big men's room in the YMCA. My collar's back in my room. I got my black trousers. I'm shaving. And some guy walks by me and says something. I don't know. I guess, yeah, good morning, whatever. And he stops and he comes back and he says, can we talk? And I figured the guy wants to talk about the game or something. I said, yeah, what is it? He must have thought I was a priest. He goes to confession. I have no idea what he said. Just totally. All I know is when it was over and done with, I just looked and I said, 3 Our Fathers, 3 Hail Marys, go in peace. So I tell this to Bob, and now the blood's back in his face, and he smiles and he says, oh my God. He said, I can't tell you how happy I am to know that when I'm in hell, I'll know at least one other person. I said, what do you mean? He said, you just like me. You may believe you were a priest and you weren't. You sent that man's soul to hell. I said, whoa, no. Hold on a second. I said, number one, what you did with that dying officer was a positive, not a negative. It was the most humane thing you could have done. I don't think you're going to hell, but if you do, that day's not a minus. That's a plus. I didn't have a sign on my back saying for confessions for free. I said, I was total shock. I said, it was nothing. I didn't intentionally do it. I said, I know you're not going to hell, but if I do, it's not for that. He said, do you really believe that? I said, Bob, there's nothing clear in my mind. About a month or two later, he calls me up around this time of year, actually. He says, I go to West Point every couple of years at this time to watch these new plebes get inducted. He said, half these guys have no idea what they're getting into. It's like when I first got inducted into the Army. He said, I just love to go up there and just kind of watch it all. He said, I'm going to go next week. Would you be interested in going? I said, Bob, I'd be happy to. I've been here many times. So we're in Eisenhower Hall. They're going through the whole indoctrination with the families. And he nudges me and he says, someone told me there's a Catholic church up here. I said, well, it's not really a church, Bob. It's a chapel. He said, you think it's open? I said, Bob, it's never closed. He said, you think they'll let us in? I said, Bob, anybody can go in. He said, let's walk over. So we walk across the fields. We walk up the hill, walk into the chapel, which is not much bigger than this room. I'm in the back and I'm thinking to myself, what is quite going on here? He walks up to the front, close to the front. He kneels down. And after a few moments, he starts shaking. He starts convulsing. He starts crying. And I'm thinking, oh, God. He finally gathers himself. He looks at me. He says, let's get the hell out of here. He's no longer with us. And I would never have asked him. But there's no doubt in my mind that was his first time back in the Catholic Church since 1944. This is like 1998. Once again, you never quite know the effect that combat and stress has on people. And so that's basically, what happened with him. I interviewed a guy, Ernie Plants. He was a submariner. He also was from rural Alabama, somewhere in that area. And he enlisted in the Navy to once again put food on the table. This is the height of the Depression. It was a horrible time. And his submarine gets sunk in February of 1942. He's a POW for 1,292 or so days. And he said to me, you know, you would think as a POW, you'd want to try to escape, and you might want to try. He said, but the problem was if any POW escaped, because we were kept in groups of 10, the other remaining guys were machine gunned. So nobody would consider escaping. And you would never discuss it with somebody, because even if you discussed the possibility, it's quite likely you wouldn't wake up the next morning because, you know, what you might do to the rest of the guys. So that was basically his story. But as I tell people, you know, these guys, if a guy was 18 on December 7, 1941, a World War II veteran was 6 years old, it was 1929, the start of the Depression. All that young kid knew at that point was how to help mommy and daddy put food on the table, whatever he could do, delivering newspapers, working on a farm, shining shoes. And for the next 12 years, till 1941, December 7th, all he knew was how to help. There was no such thing as me. Everything was we, family, neighbor, and by extension, country. And I tell people that basic training is very important. It teaches you how to use your weapon, and that's very important. But nothing more prepared these men to go forward and sacrifice they did the way they did than those 12 years, those pubescent years, those adolescent years, thinking about something beyond themselves, neighbor, and by extension, country. And they're called the greatest generation. I just hope to God there's never going to be a need for another second greatest generation. One of the men I interviewed, I say to people, I don't have a favorite, but I showed that cap to this gentleman over here. If I had to pick one favorite, it would be a fellow named Ray Hyman. He was from the South Bronx, down 138th Street, a little bit south of the Yankee Stadium. And he was born Jewish, but he never really practiced his Jewish religion. His mother worked in the garment industry. His father was a cavalryman in World War I. And one night, his father went out with his best friend Smitty. They're on maneuvers in Texas. And they took their 10-gallon hats off, filled them with beer to feed them to their horses. The horses collapsed. They were put in a stockade for a day or two. And he would often say to me his favorite movie of all time was Blazing the Saddles. It always reminded him of his father. And when he was about 13 years old, he just ran away to join what he considered to be the service. He joined some kind of a military transport group. And after about 6 months or so, he was brought before a juvenile judge, as he say, little guy with a bow tie, Judge Pankey. And he said, if you come before me again before you're 16, you're going to reform school. So Ray waits until he's 16 and he joins the Navy. He's in the South Pacific. He sees on the bulletin board, they're looking for volunteers for a new type of warfare, underwater demolition teams, UDT, forerunners of the Navy SEALs. He thinks to himself, hey, this is really cool. I learned how to swim in the Bronx River. I pretty much know all there is to know. Let me volunteer. And he becomes a UDT frogman. They were called naked warriors because the only thing they had to protect themselves was a bayonet. And their job was to go in pre-invasion to the invasion sites with a chalkboard to basically, as best they could, determine which was the safest entrance, the least amount of obstacles for the landing Marines. And he was involved in several campaigns, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He was the second or third wave in for Iwo Jima. And they had all these dead Marines on the ground, and they were uncovered. And the Marine general, they call him Howling Raven Mad Smith, put the order out. I don't want my dead Marines covered. I want them exposed so the oncoming Marines will be more motivated to kill the enemy. Ray takes his poncho off and covers a dead Marine. An officer comes over and says, uncover that man. And he said, no, sir, I won't. Uncover that man or I'll have you court-martial. Sir, you can court-martial him. I'm not going to uncover him. We'll come back to that a little bit later. During the invasion of Okinawa, the UDT men were told to forget everything they were taught about stealth. to go in and make as much noise as possible. The whole idea, ideally, hopefully, was to divert as many Japanese from one end of the island to the other. And they were very successful. As bad as the Marine Corps landing casualties were on Okinawa day one, it was a lot less than they expected. And Ray said to me, he said, you know, I always consider that the greatest military April Fool's Day of all time. It was April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. He said, someday I'm going to write that story up. He never got a chance to write the story up. I was able to write it for him. We got it published and he was very happy. And I would call Ray every couple of weeks, a month or so. And, hey, Ray, how you doing? I called him one day and I said, hey, Ray, it's Bob Abbott. How are you? Oh, I said, I'm dying. I said, what? You know, I got cancer, larynx, I'm dying. And I said, oh, I said, Ray, I'm so sorry. He said, no. He said, I should have died during the war. He said, what's killing me is some SOB's got my fins. I said, what do you mean? He said, some SOB's got my fins. What happened was Ray's fins that he used in all of his operations, with a razor blade wrote his name, Hyman, on each of his two fins. Donated them to the SEAL Museum in Fort Pierce, Florida. And he'd go down every couple of years for a reunion. And the last time he was down there, he was in UDT Team 14. He said to the proprietor, my fins are not in the showcase. What's what I'm saying is a little girl. Where are my fins? And the guy said, oh, no, we're renovating. They're in the warehouse and we'll bring them back when we're finished. And he had no reason to doubt that. He had gotten a call that week from a collector on the West Coast. And the guy himself is a snorkeler. And he said, are you Ray Hyman from UDT Team 14? Yeah, who are you? He said, well, I got your fins here, and I would really appreciate it if you would send me a letter authenticating that these are really valid UDT World War II fins. And Ray understandably ripped me, you know what, and hung up. And I said to Ray, I said, Ray, you got his phone number? Yeah. He's like, what's his mail thing? I said, you got email? Yeah, he gives me an email. I said, fine. I said, look, don't talk to him. If he calls, you're not home. Don't answer the phone. Don't talk to him. And I called the guy up and I said, look, I don't doubt that you bought these things legitimately thinking they were for sale, but they weren't. They were stolen. And here's the thing. Ray Hyman never had children. And to him, those fins mean as much to him as your children, your grandchildren mean to you and me. He's also going to die. You got to lend me those fins, and I guarantee you within a day or two after he's dead, I'm going to mail them back to you. Oh, no, I'm not. I said, let me ask you this. Your email address mentions LA Fireboat. What's that all about? He said, well, I'm a fireman. I'm a Los Angeles fireman. And I said, oh, I said, I can't tell you how happy I am to hear that. I said, my dad was a New York City fireman. I said, the only reason men become firemen are to save lives. I said, you cannot save Ray's life physically, but you can save Ray's life emotionally and mentally. I said, you gotta let me borrow those fins. No, let me ask you a question. Was your dad in World War II? Yeah. I said, where'd your dad serve? He was in the Navy in the South Pacific. I said, well, let's think about this. Your dad and Ray, both in the Navy, both in the South Pacific, both fighting the Japanese in the same waters at the same time. You ask your father what he thinks you should do. He said, I can't. He's been dead a long time. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. I said, look, I want you to think about this. I'm going to call you in the morning. And I didn't sleep very well that night, but I called him in the morning. He said, what's your mailing address? I said, oh, I said, I couldn't be happy. I said, can I ask you one question? He said, yeah, what is it? What made you change your mind? He said, I spoke to my dad last night. He told me to do the right thing. So he sent me the fins. Got him a couple of days later. I called Ray up. I said, Ray, I got good news. I got your fins. Bob, he said, don't BS me. He said, that's nothing to play about. I said, no. I said, they're right here in my hand as I'm talking to you. He said, Bob, he said, nothing personal. He says, I love you like a son, but I can't believe it. I got to see them. I said, no problem. So I get in my car. He lit up a mayor pack. I drove up. I gave him his fins. He couldn't have been happy. A couple of weeks later, he calls me up. Oh, by the way, prior to all of this, Ray received in the mail in around 1995, 1996, just in a plain brown envelope, not even saying where it was from, but addressed to him. He opens it up. It's the Presidential Unit Citation for his actions on the invasion of Okinawa, April 1st, 1945. Here it is 50 years later, signed by John L. Sullivan, Secretary of the Navy. You talk about mail delivery. So I thought to myself, let me at least see if I can call some retired officer to make a semi presentation to him. And I thought, let me call the Congress lady. Sue Kelly was the Congresswoman. Let me call her office. And I told them the Ray Hyman story. And the next day or the day after, I get a phone call from Congresswoman Kelly. She said, Mr. Abbott, she said, would you do me a favor? I said, ma'am, if I can, what is it? Can I make the presentation? I said, oh, that'd be wonderful. My wife and my daughter and I were invited. We get to Ray's house about a week later. Channel 2, Channel 4, Channel 7, Channel 12, they're all out there. She makes the presentation to him. They're off in the corner, and I see she's crying. So I walk over. I said, excuse me, is everything okay? And she said, oh, Bob, yeah, no. It's just that Ray was telling me about Iwo Jima and covering that dead Marine. She said, my uncle was a Marine. He was killed at Iwo Jima. I know it wasn't him that Ray covered, but I think maybe it was. So once again, you never quite know where unrelated events come back to relate. And about 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, Ray calls me up. He says, Bob, he said, I got a problem here. He said, if I have to go to the hospital or a doctor, my car's down the driveway. We got snow here. I can't really get it up the driveway. He said, I don't know what to do. But he had a son, and he had a nephew who was in the landscaping business. And I said, well, what about your nephew? I said, he's if he's in landscaping, he probably's got a truck and can do that. He said, that so-and-so wouldn't do anything for me. He said, I wouldn't even ask him. I said, no problem. So I drive up and I'm shoveling the snow in his driveway. And all of a sudden I look down, he's in the garage in his pajamas. And I said, Ray, for God's sakes, go back inside. You're going to get pneumonia. Pneumonia? What the hell? I'm going to be dead in 6 weeks. And you can't argue with Ray. So I go back to shoveling, and all of a sudden I see him going past me up the driveway. I say, Ray, in God's name, where you going? No problem. He said, I'm just going to go to the mailbox, get my mail out. He goes to the top. He gets his mail out. He comes halfway down. Boom, he does a 180. He's on the ground. Bob, I can't get up. I can't get up. And I run over to him. I go to grab him by the shoulders. All I can feel is bone. I think to myself, the last thing I want to do is break something. So I grab his pajamas and I just pick him up by his pajamas. And I'm looking at him and I'm thinking to myself, this is how it's going to end. This is the guy that fought the Japanese. And like he's a rag doll in my arms now. And within about 2 weeks or so, he was dead. I went to his funeral. He's in the casket, and across his chest, he's got his 2 fins. So once the burial was finished, I got the fins, sent them back to the guy on the West Coast, where they're in a place of memorial. So that's Ray Hyman. So that's basically the story of some of the men I've interviewed, and one man I interviewed, Lorenzo Dufo, he was African American. December 7, 1941, he was in a veterans hospital down in New Orleans, washing dishes, and he thought to himself, I gotta volunteer for the Navy. And at that point in time, Eleanor Roosevelt was very instrumental in trying to open up the armed forces. And they had one all African American ship, the USS Mason. And he and the rest of the crew were the only African American enlisted men, non-kitchen in the U.S. Navy. And he said he stopped in Atlanta on his way to New York. He was in uniform to get a cup of coffee. And the guy behind the counter serving coffee, it was his turn. He said, a cup of coffee. And the guy said, we don't have any coffee. He said, no coffee. He just gave the guy in front of me a cup of coffee. He said, we have coffee for whites. We don't have any. Once again, the N word. And he said, I was in uniform. He said, we would go to eat in a military cafeteria, but because we were black, we had to sit outside, and I could look through the window and I could see German and Italian prisoners talking with Americans, laughing, because they all shared a certain kind of common heritage. And what I say to people without any aspirations or any negativity is I look at the war, World War II, as basically 2 wars. In Europe, it was almost like a bar fight because most Americans had relatives of European heritage. And even though we were fighting them and killing them, we kind of related to them. Whereas the war in the South Pacific was like a midnight alley knife fight. And in the South Pacific, the Japanese were not just fighting for their country, they were fighting for their God, because their God in the country was one and the same. In Europe, Hitler was not God. Mussolini was not God. So, in my humble opinion, that's the sort of the difference between the two venues. So once again, I thank you for your time. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. But that's my experience. Look at this thing. Yes.
My understanding of the veterans, many of them didn't want to talk about it, okay, because obviously it was traumatic. And my father was one of them. The most I ever got out of him was the movie Patton. I said, does that movie really depict him? He says, yes. And that was it, but it seems that the people that you came in contact with, they were more than willing to tell their story.
Yes, sir.
Use the
I
mic.
still gotta use. I was surprised. I would ask every veteran, with rare exception, have you discussed this with your loved ones? And invariably the answer, oh, no, 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 no. And I was a little bit surprised initially until I thought about it. Civilians have no concept what war really is. War is 24/7, 365. One man said to me that I signed up for the Dow, and it wasn't the Dow Jones of Wall Street. It was DOW, duration of war. And for most men, duration of war was anywhere between 36 to 44 months. And if you're a combat veteran, the first question normally a child will ask, understandably, is, gee, Dad, what did you do during the war? And if you're brave and or maybe dumb enough to tell a loved one what you did as a combat veteran, invariably the second question is going to be, my God, Dad, how could you do that? Or how could you watch that? Because once again, we have no concept of the intensity of war. And as I tell people all the time, the only time the war is truly over for the combat veteran is the day he dies. Because every day he's alive, he's paying the price physically, emotionally, PTSD, whatever that piece of it is, there's always a piece. It never goes away. And that's the reason why these men never discussed it. Now, here I was a guy who was in the military. You didn't have to explain every fourth word. I never shared anything like what they went through, but they felt almost like it was going to confession. Here's a guy that understands somewhat what I'm telling him. I get it all out, and I don't have to deal with him over Christmas or Thanksgiving or any other time. It's just out and boom, I can pack it, put it away. That was my humble opinion as to why. And yeah, a few of the men did discuss it with their family, but very, very few. The other thing I find very surprising is when I find out, and this has happened so many times now, I accept it, but I cannot understand it. When I find one of my guys dies, I get the obituary whenever I can, call the next of kin. And invariably I'll say, look, I interviewed your father. Would you like a copy of the transcript? And almost invariably it's, can I think about it? Can I call you back? Okay, I'll wait a month, couple of weeks. So when I call him back a second time, I just wanted to check that and I believe in baseball, 3 strikes you're out. I'll never call a person a third time. But it happens more times than not. And I still cannot understand it. But I've come to accept it. Yeah.
I can relate to everything you said. My father was in the World War I and talked a lot about Germany. My brother was in World War II, and I was just in time to enlist in the Air Force for the Korean conflict. I put in my 4 years, 1 year in Korea, but after they assigned. And I'm very happy for you to relate it to them. And I'm very happy to say that I also grew up in the South Bronx. And I am now 92 years old.
Oh,
and
God
I
bless
still
you.
feel great. I still drive. I still walk.
That's phenomenal.
And I'm very happy.
That's wonderful.
So I thank you for putting that on.
I'm 82. I can only hope I look like you in 10 years. I do that. I just have a question. When I worked in the museum in New Orleans, historical records.
I called that museum several years ago. And I asked to speak to the director. And I don't know if I spoke to the director or an assistant director, but somebody said they were director. And I told him, I've got hundreds of hours of World War II tapes and I'll be happy to. He said, buddy, don't take this personal. He said, we got so many GD interviews down here. The last thing we need are anymore. This was the World War II Museum. Now, obviously, I may have spoken to the wrong guy, but that's the reaction I got there.
Did speak to the wrong guy. I have a few other things to share. For the veterans in the room, have you ever participated in the honor flight? Do you know what it is? All I can do is from my heart to yours is to say it is a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I'd like to share something else that may be amazing to you. My Uncle Richard was killed in Normandy in World War II in the Battle of Mortain, and I was obviously named after him. And for those of you that are familiar with Mamaroneck, my grandparents, well, let me tell you a little bit more about the background. Richard was killed in Normandy, and then 6 months later, his best friend, who had spent a lot of time with my grandparents at their home. Then the kid across the street was killed. And the kids that lived 2 doors down, this is on Beach Avenue in Larchmont. My grandparents were so overwhelmed with grief that my grandfather decided he was going to build a memorial park to all the kids from Mamaroneck and Larchmont that lost their lives in World War II. And that was 101, as it turns out to be. He built a memorial park. It was the first memorial park in the country dedicated to World War II veterans. He actually conceived it in 1945. As you know, that's the year the war was over. And it was dedicated in 1946. Anyway, in the year 2000, the Mamaroneck School Board decided they were going to destroy this memorial park and they were going to make it a parking lot. And I actually personally, as a veteran, as the executor of my grandfather's estate, and as a citizen of the community, when the school board sued the Attorney General, who was Elliot Spitzer at the time, his office sided with the school board and said that I didn't have any standing. The blessing I got is that we were assigned a judge, Judge Bellantoni, who was a World War II veteran. So when we got to court, he obviously slammed the school board. But the memorial is there today. The community has stepped up to do it. But there is an incredible breakdown in values from what you're talking about and the men who served to today. Now, Tom Brokaw supported us. Actually, Steve Colbert, one of his relatives is on that monument. There's a Brokaw on the monument too, but it's not Tom's relative. But anyway, as a veteran, I actually was blessed. I'm a Vietnam era veteran. I was in the combat arms. I got the blessing of being released from active duty the month after we sent troops. But out of my OCS company, in 2 years, we were all second lieutenants, combat platoon leaders, and half of them were gone. And then, of course, Nixon in 1973 did away with the draft. And from that moment on, there's been such a breakdown, whatever. I actually wrote a poem, if I may read it. And this is written as one of the World War II veterans. It's very short, if I can find it.
This point, absolutely mind-boggling that anybody would, for 1 second, consider destroying that monument for a parking lot of anything.
Well, I'm going to say something that not only was a breakdown in value, but it was with the adults, the school board members. There were 7 school board members. 5 of them were attorneys. They were very arrogant, very much. What they did is, the backstory of this is they wanted to float a school bond for $54 million when the school budget was only $78 million. So they effectively wanted to tell the community, we're doubling your school taxes. And they figured in order to sell that, they'd have to go and tell the high school football coach, we're going to build you a new athletic field. The high school teachers, and let's say the chemistry teacher or the biology teacher, we're going to build you a new laboratory. The library, we're going to expand the library. So they're doing a lot of PR. And then when they decided to expand the parking lot so their kids could drive their BMWs or whatnot to school, they said to the town that they didn't mention that they were going to make this into a parking lot. What they did is we're going to build another athletic field. The Mamaroneck Police Department went there and said, you're not going to build a varsity field right along the the Boston Post Road. By the way, the memorial is very prominent. It's almost the length of a football field right on the Boston Post Road. We go back to 1775 or 1776, we could have watched George Washington and the Continental Army march right past the post, right past the memorial. Anyway, long story short, they lied to everybody. They said they weren't going to build a parking lot, but I have their plan, actually their site plan, and it's clearly going to be a parking lot. Anyway, they lied to the press over and over again, but I don't want to go in that too more, because if I start telling that story, we'll be here for another 2 hours. But anyway, this is the poem I wrote, and it's entitled, "Who Among You?" And this is a tribute to all of you who came today to listen to Bob, because you care, you're here. But look at how many people are not here. So it is a joyful time of year now, with spring bursting out all over, with classes soon to end and summer vacations to begin. But for these veterans, well, we won't be here. Excuse me. But for these veterans, they won't be here. They never made it back. How special it would have been for them to go fishing with the kids they never had, to buy flowers for the wives they would have wed. But that's what war does. It destroys dreams along with lives, lots of them. It breaks hearts, lots of them too. Was it worth it, you ask, to go off to war at 18 or 19 or 20 and to die, to lose everything so young? Maybe not for them. Maybe the important question is, was it worth it for you? Was your freedom worth their dying for? Your lives and values worth protecting? Who among you would trade places with them? Who remembers what they did and what they suffered, what they lost and what they won? Who will honor their memories and be thankful? Will you? Thank you. Thank you.
That was a beautiful poem, and this is just a little anecdote and very relevant to that. I happen to love baseball. All right. And, well, I say that again.
Microphone by your mouth so we can hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I heard an interview with some time ago with Bobby Feller, who, for those who might not know, he was an ace pitcher for what was then the Cleveland Indians. And he was being interviewed because he was a survivor of D-Day. And that was the occasion. And he was introduced by the interviewer as, we have here a true athlete and hero of World War II. And he said, first of all, he was no hero. He was happy and more than willing to serve his country. He had volunteered, which meant giving up important years in his baseball career. He said he was no hero. The heroes were the boys who didn't come home. Just thought it.
Thank you. I'm not sure about if you know about this at all, why the reason was, but I guess I have a friend and her father, she never met her father, but he was in World War II in Europe and he didn't make it back. And he's buried in Belgium. And she said it's very hard for her to go there with the expense and everything. Do you know why they didn't bring the bodies of, were there too many soldiers at the time?
The 3,070 American veterans that fought.
Just use the mic because we're recording and otherwise no one who watches the recording will hear.
Okay, the United States government gave the families or the next of kin the option either to repatriate their bodies or to have them buried at a permanent cemetery. Now, interestingly, things like the American Cemetery in, was it Courteville in France? But the American Cemetery that overlooks Omaha Beach, that is actually been given by the French to the United States. So it's actually American territory. And that was true of some of these other memorials. So the answer is that the option was given to the families, and it was either a choice to do it or not. Now, my uncle is buried now in Farmingdale on Long Island in the National Cemetery, but originally he was buried in France. And that's the story. So. Yeah, they did. When the letters that went out to the families to announce that their loved ones had been killed, they were told where they were interred and then given that option. Now, I can't speak for everyone. I can speak for my family, and my grandfather and my grandmother wanted to have Richard's remains returned. And the other ones were, if that temporary cemetery was in Maringe in France, and then they moved them to the American Cemetery, the main one. But I hope that answers your question.